Part 1. The Arrival Scene. 1. The Transport. The transport truck rumbled across the dusty roads of rural Texas, its wooden bed packed with 37 women whose eyes held the same mixture of fear, confusion, and exhaustion. They were Japanese military auxiliaries, nurses, communication specialists, medics, and clerical staff, captured during the final desperate months of Pacific warfare. Their uniforms hung loose on frames made thin by rationing and stress. Their hands trembled not from cold but from the weight of not knowing what came next. Among them sat Fumiko Tanaka, barely 23 years old, a surgical nurse from a military hospital in Manila. She had been told countless times that American soldiers were beasts. The propaganda had been relentless and specific. American men, she had learned, saw captured women not as human beings but as spoils of war. They were undisciplined, crude, driven by base desires. She had heard stories, some whispered by officers, some spread by the military press, of atrocities committed by American forces. Villages burned, women violated, the dishonor of capture made worse by the cruelty that followed. Fumiko's mother had clutched her hands before she left for duty 3 years ago. "If you are ever captured," her mother had whispered, her voice barely audible, "there are ways. There are pills. Do not let them—" She had not finished the sentence. She did not need to. Every woman in the military understood what her mother was trying to say. Now, as the truck lurched around a corner, Fumiko felt that conversation returned to her mind with terrible clarity. She looked at the faces around her, some younger, some older, all showing signs of the same dread. A woman next to her, a communication specialist named Akiko, was whispering prayers under her breath. Another woman, a medic named Yuki, sat with her eyes fixed on nothing, as though she had already left her body behind. The truck began to slow. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, Fumiko caught glimpses of a military installation emerging from the heat haze. Guard towers, barbed wire fences, American flags snapping in the Texas wind, and everywhere, soldiers. Tall men in crisp uniforms moving with the efficiency of an organized machine. Her heart began to pound so violently she thought the other women must surely hear it. The truck came to a complete stop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a voice, American and authoritative, called out commands. The tailgate was lowered with a metallic screech. Blinding sunlight flooded in, and the heat that had seemed merely oppressive inside the truck became an almost physical force pressing down on them. "Out!" a voice commanded in English. An interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier, translated. "Carefully, form 2 lines, no rushing." The women moved like automatons, their legs stiff from hours of sitting, their minds screaming with the anticipation of what might come next. As Fumiko's feet touched the ground, she braced herself. She had read every account, heard every rumor. This was the moment when military discipline would give way to appetite. This was when the soldiers would begin to see them as something less than human, more than machinery to be used. She stepped onto the Texas soil and looked up. American soldiers stood in lines on either side of them, weapons held at their sides, faces giving away absolutely nothing. They were tall, yes, and well-fed in a way that even the healthiest Japanese officers were not. Their uniforms were perfectly maintained, their boots polished to a shine that reflected the sun. But there was no grinning, no leering, no catcalls or whistles or any of the crude behavior Fumiko had been told to expect. The soldiers stood at attention like statues, watching the prisoners move through their ranks with an expression of professional detachment that was somehow more unsettling than any display of hostility could have been. An officer stepped forward, and the interpreter repeated his words in Japanese. "Welcome to Camp Polk. You are now prisoners of war under the protection of the United States military. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Follow all orders from your guards and from camp authorities. No harm will come to you if you follow the rules." The words seemed to hang in the air, impossible to process. Fumiko's mind was caught in a loop of contradiction. This was not what she had been prepared for. Every fiber of her being was braced for violation, humiliation, cruelty, and instead, She was being told about the Geneva Convention in a respectful tone by an interpreter. Behind her, she heard Akiko stop praying. Scene 2. Processing and Protocol. The intake tent smelled of canvas and disinfectant. A line of American medics stood behind tables, clipboards in hand, their expressions carefully neutral. As each woman moved forward, they were asked her name, her age, her military unit. Her answers were recorded in neat handwriting on forms that would, she later learned, become the official record of her captivity. An identification tag was issued to Fumiko, a simple metal disc on a chain bearing a number and a date. She was given a uniform, plain cotton in a tan color that matched nothing in the aesthetics of Japanese military dress. She was given sheets, a towel, a small kit containing a toothbrush, soap, and a comb. "You will have access to fresh water daily," the interpreter explained, reading from a document. "You will be provided with 3 meals per day. Medical care will be available upon request. You must keep yourself and your assigned quarters clean. Any violations of camp rules will result in disciplinary action." It sounded like a list of facts being recited by someone reading from a prepared statement. Because, Fumiko realized, that's exactly what it was. This was not a conversation. This was not an interrogation or a threat. This was procedure, protocol. The implementation of a system designed to process human beings into the category of prisoner. It was somehow more frightening than cruelty. The physical examination came next. Female medics, American women in military uniforms, conducted initial health assessments. Fumiko was taken into a partitioned area where a medic, a woman perhaps 30 years old with competent hands and a tired expression, checked her vital signs, examined her wounds, and reviewed her medical history. "You have an infected cut on your left arm," the medic said in English. The interpreter translated, "We'll clean that and bandage it properly. Have you had any vaccination for typhoid?" The medic wore gloves. She spoke through the interpreter. She did not touch Fumiko unnecessarily. When the examination was complete, she looked Fumiko in the eye, said, "You'll be fine," and gestured toward the next station. It was a moment of contact that, in its very professionalism, felt revolutionary. Scene 3. The barracks realization. The barracks were nothing like Fumiko had imagined. She had half expected a dungeon, or at least the cramped conditions she had known in military housing. Instead, she found a simple wooden building with high windows, rows of metal bunks with actual mattresses, and enough space to walk between the beds without squeezing past bodies. The women were assigned their bunks. Fumiko was given one on the second level, near a window. She climbed up and sat on the bare mattress, running her hands over the metal frame. A female interpreter, a WAC volunteer named Sergeant Helen Martinez, appeared with an armful of bedding. "You'll want to make your bunk," she said, speaking slowly so that even those with minimal English could understand. She demonstrated how to fit the sheets and fold the blanket. She showed them the posted schedules, the rules for using the latrines, the procedures for requesting medical attention. "Lights out is at 9 p.m., Sergeant Martinez continued. "Roll call is at 7 in the morning. Breakfast begins at 6. Any questions?" There were none. The women were too overwhelmed to formulate questions, even if they had dared. That first night, Fumiko lay in her bunk listening to the sounds of the camp settling into darkness. Outside, she could hear the footsteps of guards on patrol. Inside, she heard the quiet rustling of other women arranging their blankets, the occasional whisper in Japanese, someone crying softly into her pillow. She waited for something to happen, some violation of the safety they had been promised, some cruel joke about the rules. Nothing happened. Hours passed. The guards continued their patrols. No one entered the barracks except to check that everyone was present and accounted for. No one tried the doors. No one made any attempt to cross the boundaries that had been established. When Fumiko finally fell asleep, it was not from fear wearing away into exhaustion. It was from genuine confusion about what captivity was supposed to mean. Part 2. The Discovery Scene. 4. Days of routine. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of Camp Polk became as familiar as breathing. Wake at 6, roll call at 7. Breakfast in the mess hall, served by civilian workers, not guards. Work assignments ranging from kitchen duty to laundry to maintenance of the campgrounds, lunch, afternoon roll call, supper, evening hours in the barracks where women could write letters, read, sew, or simply sit in the unaccustomed luxury of having time to themselves. The guards maintained their distance with an almost mechanical consistency. They delivered orders through interpreters. They supervised work details from a distance. When supplies needed to be carried, they directed without touching. When a woman fell while carrying water, a guard helped her up without lingering or making conversation. The act of assistance was performed as a duty, nothing more. For women raised in a culture where power often meant the ability to humiliate, where military hierarchy had been built on the threat of casual cruelty, this professional distance was deeply disorienting. "What do you think they're waiting for?" Akiko asked one evening as they sat on their bunks speaking in low Japanese. "All these rules, all this distance. They're waiting for us to let our guard down. And then what?" Yuki interrupted. "They treat us like hospital patients, feed us regular meals, provide medical care." Her voice held a note of something between sarcasm and wonder. "Maybe they're just following rules." "No one follows rules that completely," Akiko insisted. "There's always someone who breaks. Always." But there wasn't. That was the thing that eventually became clear to every woman in the camp. The Americans, for whatever reason, were not breaking the rules. Not even once. By the third week, something had shifted in the barracks. The constant vigilance that had characterized the first days began to ease. Women no longer jumped when guards passed. They did not spend their nights braced for assault. They began to have conversations that ranged beyond immediate survival. They began to wonder about home, about what waited for them after the war, about whether the version of Americans they had been taught was, perhaps, not entirely accurate. Scene 5. The first letter. Mail call came on a Thursday afternoon. The interpreter handed out stationery and explained the policy. Each woman could write one letter every 2 weeks. Letters would be reviewed for security violations, but otherwise passed through. No personal notes to guards, no messages that revealed camp layout or security details. Everything else was permitted. Fumiko stared at the blank page for a long time before picking up the pencil. What could she possibly say that would make sense to her mother? How could she explain that she was a prisoner, yet also being treated with a courtesy she had never experienced, even in freedom? She began to write in careful hiragana. "Mother, I am alive. I am safe. They feed us. The place is clean. I do not know when I will return to you, but I wanted you to know that I am surviving." It was not the letter she had imagined writing, the one that would smuggle information about her torment or include hidden messages of defiance. It was a simple statement of fact, a contradiction of what she had been told to believe about American brutality. Other women wrote similar letters. Some added details about the food, about the medical care, about the routine. As interpreters collected the letters for censoring, there was a moment of collective fear. Would the letters be censored so heavily that they became meaningless? Would there be punishment for anything they had written? The letters were delivered to families across the Pacific, crossing an ocean and weeks of military bureaucracy, to arrive at homes where mothers and fathers and siblings were desperate for any word of their loved one's fate. When replies came, 3 weeks later, they were read with trembling hands and eyes filled with tears. "She says she received my letter," Fumiko whispered, her voice breaking. "She says thank you. She says she is grateful that I am alive." For the first time since her capture, Fumiko understood something she had not fully comprehended before. That captivity, however orderly and humane, was still separation. That the relief she felt at being treated with respect was inextricably mixed with the grief of being far from home. That surviving was not the same as living. But it was something. It was more than she had expected. Scene 6. The Garden Project. In the 5th week of captivity, the camp commandant announced a new initiative. The campgrounds would include a small garden where the women could grow vegetables to supplement the camp's food supply. The women would maintain the garden, the guards would supervise, but minimal instruction would be provided. It seemed like a small thing, a minor adjustment to camp routine. But to the women, it meant something entirely different. For the first time since capture, they would be creating something that was not mandated by military protocol. Something that was, in a small way, their own. The garden plot was marked out near the eastern fence, an area perhaps 30 feet by 40 feet, with reasonable soil and access to water. Fumiko and Akiko and Yuki and a dozen other women were assigned to the project. They were given seeds, tomato plants, green beans, squash, simple vegetables that would grow in the Texas climate. On the first day, they worked in near silence, preparing the soil, planting seeds, creating rows. The guards stood at a distance, watching but not interfering. The sun beat down on them as it always did, but somehow the work felt different. It felt like they were creating rather than merely surviving. As the weeks passed and green shoots began to emerge from the soil, something shifted in the barracks. Women spoke of the garden project with an energy that went beyond mere food production. They were tending something that would grow. They were participating in a process that had a future. One afternoon, as Fumiko was watering the tomato plants, she noticed one of the guards pause in his patrol. He watched for a moment, then continued his route without comment. But in that moment of observation, Fumiko understood something. The guard was not merely supervising. He was witnessing what they were creating. And in witnessing, he was acknowledging that what they were doing mattered. Part 3. The hospital scene. 7. The injury. It happened on a humid afternoon in late July. Fumiko was working in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for the evening meal, when another woman, a medic named Keiko, was carrying a stack of hot pans from the oven. She stumbled on a raised board in the floor, and the pans clattered to the ground in a chaos of noise and pain. Keiko went down with them, her right arm taking the brunt of the impact. There was blood, quite a bit of it. And the sound Keiko made when she fell indicated that more than just the surface had been injured. Within minutes, an American medic appeared. He examined Keiko's arm with careful hands, asking questions through an interpreter, checking for broken bones, assessing the severity of the burn from the hot pans. "She needs to go to the hospital," he said. "She's got a deep laceration and burns. We can bandage it here, but she should get proper medical attention." The hospital. Fumiko had not thought about the hospital. No one in the barracks had mentioned it. The camp had a medical tent and basic facilities, but rumors whispered about the larger hospital off base where American soldiers were treated. The idea of being taken there filled Fumiko with a dread she had not felt in weeks. "I can stay here," Keiko said, her face pale with pain and fear. "It is not so bad. I can work." But the medic was already calling for a transport vehicle. Within an hour, Keiko was being loaded into a truck, her arm carefully splinted and bandaged, her expression a mixture of pain and anxiety. She was not alone. The medic who had assessed her, a man named Dr. Harrison, accompanied her. And surprisingly, an interpreter was also assigned to make the journey. That evening, when Keiko did not return, worry spread through the barracks like a contagion. What if she never came back? What if the hospital was where they truly intended to harm them? What if everything they had been shown so far was simply a long deception? Fumiko could not sleep. She lay in her bunk listening to the whispers around her, each woman adding her own fears to the collective dread.